to Sociological Research, author Richard T. Schaefer. In this chapter, we're going to cover the scientific method. So really want to focus on Module 5, 6, and 7, and I may just touch on briefly the developments of methodology and maybe go over a couple of examples. The appendix here in the chapter is really useful if you are, again, going to go further in sociology or any other research projects, how to write a research report and using statistics and graphs. It gives you the basic descriptive statistics, which are often used by sociologists in their journal articles. Just a look ahead, questions that are going to be covered in the chapter include: how do sociologists go about setting up a research project? We do things scientifically, so we'll go through that method. How do sociologists ensure that the results of the research are reliable and accurate? We want to check for reliability and validity. And can sociologists carry out their research without violating the rights of those they study? So we have a code of ethics that we'll cover to see how we do that. Now, the scientific method is a systematic, organized series of steps that ensures maximum objectivity and consistency in researching a problem. Now, this is something we're probably familiar with from way back in our days of elementary school, but we're going to go through these steps to see the more mature way of doing research scientifically as we prepare for writing for journals or reading journal articles, even if you're not writing them. Oftentimes we have to research information, and scholarly peer-reviewed articles are the ones we turn to, and they need to follow these steps in order to be published in those journals. So it is extremely important to really distinguish those types of research articles than just the everyday information that we're bombarded with, through the internet and social media and things like that. Not all that information is accurate. We're constantly exposed to it, so we can be very, often misled by some of the information we receive. But the scientific method ensures that the research will be accurate. And so these are the 5 basic steps in the scientific method, and I'm going to go through. We're going to look at these steps, and then I'm going to go through them each individually. So we're going to define the problem. We need to review the literature, formulate the hypothesis, select a research design, and there are a number of research designs which we'll talk about, analyze the data, and then develop a conclusion. And that conclusion is often the end of research, but it's also the beginning and the next step in the research process. So it's just an ongoing circular process. And we'll see that illustrated here next. So this is a nice way to kind of visualize. So for visual learners, this might help to see how the process really does operate. We define the problem, we develop a research question, think about what are we interested in and how can we operationalize it. We need to review literature, so do some background on what's been done in the area, what's missing. We review that literature, formulate a testable hypothesis. Can we prove or disprove what we believe about that research? And we need to select a research design, collect and analyze the data. And that's sort of a map, a plan on how to collect and analyze our data. And those are the basic ones we're going to cover: survey, ethnography, experiment, and existing or secondary resources, we call them. And then we develop the conclusion. We have to conclude whatever findings we have found, and then we prepare a summary or report on that research and propose ideas on how can we better this research. What can we do? What could we have done if we were able to, but we were limited? Oftentimes we are limited in the type of research based on funding, finances, time, things like that. And so we propose those ideas for future research, and then and then the wheel starts all over again. Okay, so the first step in the process, we have these 5 steps, remember. Now the first step is to define the problem as clearly as possible. Most topics that we choose to research or to study about are very broad. So you might be interested in education. Well, what about education? Are you worried about the students? Okay, so let's think about students. What concern do you have about students in the education system? There's a big topic that parents are concerned if their children are being bullied. Now we're in this new age of technology, so we start to really fine-tune a large topic, the education system, how students are learning in a public education environment, and we really start to fine-tune bullying in schools, and how does that affect the children in public schools. And then maybe even further than that, with the technology, cyberbullying is a new topic, a new area on the horizon. We want to be able to understand that. So we start to really develop what is known as a research question. And what question are we trying to answer? What are we going to study? And that sometimes can take a number of drafts in sort of refining and developing that research question. Once you determine what you are going to study, we need to develop what is known as an operational definition. And and we have to do this for each concept that we are examining. And so that operational definition is an explanation of something often is very abstract. So it's abstract concept that is specific enough to allow a researcher to assess the concept. So if education and bullying is what we're interested in, how do we define education, the years of schooling that that student has? If we're looking at bullying, is it verbal? Is it physical? Is it on the internet? We need to clearly operationalize, and how can we measure these things? So an operational definition is an explanation of an abstract concept. What are some other abstract concepts? So what if I say health? How do we operationalize health? And especially in the environment we're in today, is it, we're now taking people's temperatures to really determine are they well or are they sick? So it's not just enough to say I'm healthy. Well, do I exercise every day? Do I eat right? What are my vital statistics? That's a good measure, a barometer of how healthy someone is. What's their blood pressure? What's their temperature? All those other, what is their weight? When you come up with those sort of concrete ways of measuring something that's very abstract, which is someone's health. Same thing with education. What is education? You can't touch it, but it's the knowledge we obtain, and how can we measure that knowledge? We often give tests or IQ tests, or ask the person how many years of schooling they have. That's one way, another way, a simple way of measuring it. Testing their knowledge of a particular subject matter. So again, something very abstract, education, we need to operationalize. One last one, religion. Religion is another topic that's very abstract. And so, we ask someone, are you religious? What religion are you? But does that mean, what does that mean to someone? They could say that they're Christian, but they don't attend services. So the degree of religiosity would be important to know. How often does someone attend church services? Someone who attends daily, someone who attends church services frequently would be have a higher degree of religiosity than someone who just says, I am Christian. And also we have this bullet here, prejudice. It may be defined as a person's unwillingness to hire or work with a member of a minority group, or somebody that stereotypes another based on particular characteristics. And we can sort of operationalize prejudice, and we can measure it that way. If this person doesn't hire people that are different from them, that could be a way to measure that person's prejudice. Another example Just one more example is if I were trying to study, I was interested in adolescent pregnancy as a graduate student. So I was studying teen moms, and an operational definition of adolescent moms would be the age of the mom. I would look in a database and select, moms of a particular age that I was interested in studying and focusing on. What was their age at the time they gave birth? But I was also interested in their children. So I wanted to further examine the children of adolescent moms. How was their well-being? And in this data set, I was able to look, it was longitudinal. I was able to look at both data on the mom and data on the child. And so I needed to concretely, I need to operationalize, the age of the child, what how well were they doing in school, and what other measures that were included in the data set that ensure that they were doing well. So it's just another example to share. Now, the second step in the research process is reviewing the literature. This process helps us to refine the problem that we are studying. It helps us to clarify the data collection, whatever data collection technique we're using, and it helps us to reduce mistakes. So we want to look at scholarly studies of information, peer-reviewed articles. And this is really important because you may be replicating something that's already been studied, or the data process might be have been something that's been used before, and there might have been problems in it. And so you want to make sure that you look at the relevant research in that area. Maybe it's dated and you're updating it. So you're finding the gaps in the literature to kind of fill. And the example, a perfect example I can give is what happened to me in my dissertation research. I was working on my dissertation proposal, and my particular topic on adolescent moms and the well-being of their children. As I was reviewing the literature, my mentor and I came across an article that was just published. It was a very timely article in the time that I was studying it, and the research was exactly my plan of study and my plan of approach using the same data set. And so had I not looked at the relevant research, I would have missed that and continued to work on something that was already out there and published. And so it kind of helped me to revise my hypothesis, or revise the way I was looking at things. And it really helps you to avoid making any mistakes, or even address some of the issues that came up in that particular person's research project. So it's very important to really look at that and find out what other research has been done in the particular area that you're studying. And it gives you a lot of background knowledge too. So you continually build a reference list on articles and things that you do look at. It does help in refining your problem. The next step is formulating the hypothesis. And for anyone who does scientific research, a hypothesis is a speculative statement about the relationship between two or more factors known as variables. And this hypothesis needs to be a testable hypothesis. How will you prove or disprove your statement? And usually it is in the form of a statement. You usually, believe that one variable influences another. So say I was studying a person's education and its impact on their level of income. So I would state, I believe that the higher your income, the higher your education, the higher your income will be. And so you pretty much state that, and then you go in your research, you're going to try to either prove that happens or disprove it. Now, variable, as I mentioned, a variable known as education and a variable known as income. These are measurable traits. We can measure these. These are a measurable trait or a characteristic that is subject to change under different conditions. So they can vary from person to person. Income, religion, education, age, gender, race and ethnicity. These are all examples of variables, and they vary from person to person. We have two kinds of variables. We have what are known as independent variables and dependent variables. So we classify these variables according to what one variable can actually influence the other. So the independent variable is hypothesized to cause or influence another. So it can cause or influence change in the dependent variable. The dependent variables are changed, those are the ones that are changed or influenced by the dependent variable. So they're dependent on the independent variable. And we usually illustrate them like this. The independent variable is usually illustrated by the letter X, and the dependent variable is illustrated by the letter Y. And we draw an arrow showing that the independent variable is what's causing the change in the dependent variable. So in my example, I would say that good thing this has an eraser. Education is my independent variable, and income is my dependent variable. So I want to see, is the higher a person's educational level, is there a correlation or relationship in the amount of income that they make? And there's different ways to measure that person's income. Is it their personal income? Is it their household income? So we need to, again, clarify those different things. Now, a couple more terms. Causal logic is the relationship between a condition or variable and a particular consequence, with one event leading to the other. So, in the example I'm using about education and income, there's some causal logic in that a change in a person's education will lead to a change in a person's income. Or let's think about studying for a test. You've got a test next week, so your time spent studying may result in a higher grade on the exam. So the more time you spend studying, the higher your grade will be on that exam. Now, correlation exists when change in one variable coincides with a change in the other. This is only an indication that one variable causes an event in another variable. It does not indicate causation. So correlation does not necessarily indicate causation. It might be something else. So if we look at our letters again, X being the independent variable, Y being the dependent variable, well, what if it's some other variable? We want to control for these other variables. So that would be Z. And what is that? We want to hold that constant so that we can really show that the relationship between education and income is true if we hold all other things constant. So we seek to identify what that causal relationship is, that causal link between the variables. So the causal link is what we generally describe in our hypothesis. It is what we would like to prove or disprove. And here are some further examples. I think I might have touched on a couple of these. The level of educational degree, the higher your degree level, the higher your level of income. The degree of lack of integration into society. This is Emil Durkheim's study that we talked about in Chapter 1, influencing the dependent variable being the likelihood of suicide. The availability of affordable housing as an independent variable. What availability of that? Is there affordable housing? And what level of homelessness exists? Is there a relationship there? Parents' church attendance. How much does that influence children's church attendance? This one I did already mention, the time spent preparing for a quiz and your performance on that quiz. You know, the less time you study, the lower your quiz score. The more time you study, the higher your quiz score. And then the last one is parents' income and your actual ability to, a child's ability to go to school. So these are just additional examples in your text. Our next step in the research process is to develop a research design. This guides our research in collecting data. So in most studies, we carefully select a sample. Ideally, we'd like to study every member of the population, but realistically, that's not possible, especially if we're looking at large population. So we want to take a sample from that population, and a sample is a selection from the larger population that is statistically typical of that population. People collect samples because the population is often way too large to be studied. Random samples are used most frequently in order to get the best representation of the population. So that is when every member of a population has the same chance of being selected. There are different types of random samples, so we'll just keep it general at this point. There's stratified random samples, and there's different ways to select those members to make sure that each person has an equally likely chance of being selected into our study. Other types of samples could be known as a snowball sample, or what we call a convenience sample. And these are samples that are used when participants are difficult to come by. And a lot of the topics we study can be very sensitive, and so not everybody likes to, volunteer, or when they're picked, do they even want to participate? So we need to really gain the trust of our person that's under study. So the participants are recruited by word of mouth. We may talk to one person and say, do you have anybody else who might be interested in talking to me? And so that's how we sort of snowball. We kind of, get the word out there that we're doing this, and hopefully gain that trust of different individuals and have them participate. It's often critiqued because of the way it's, people are recruiting themselves into our study, and so ideally you'd like to have a random sample to be able to generalize. But sometimes, the argument is that you would not have gotten anyone to answer your questions if you didn't do it in that format. So there are, pros and cons. Next thing we want to be conscious of is the validity and reliability. The scientific method requires that the results of our studies be both valid and reliable. Validity refers to the degree to which a measure or scale accurately reflects the phenomenon under study. Is the data being gathered, is it accurate? Was the question written clearly enough to get accurate data? You want to make sure there's integrity in the data set. Is the data set clean? Did it have complete data? Because there are a lot of problems that when you're building large data sets that can occur. Missing data, so then it could jeopardize your results. Reliability refers to the extent to which a measure produces consistent results. It's usually a way to check. You can follow up with a question. Like I mentioned earlier, your religion. You can ask a person, what is your religion? But if you don't follow up that question with how often do you attend services, you really don't get a sense of what the degree of religiosity is. You can ask a woman her age, and she may not be truthful. So you might want to ask their age, but also then ask for their birth date so that you confirm that that birth date is accurate. The last step in the process is, and the first step in the next level of study, is the development of the conclusion. So the conclusion represents both an end and a beginning in our research. So number one, you want to, did our research support the hypothesis? In some studies, they do not always generate the data that support the original hypothesis, and this leads to sort of a time where we need to maybe reformulate formulate anything, any part of we formulate the hypothesis and the conclusion, and make adjustments to our research design. And then we might, I already mentioned about, even be controlling for other factors. A control variable is a factor held constant to test the impact that independent variable has. And so that was that letter Z. You might want to control for gender. You might want to control for race. Is this impact similar for people of different races, of different genders? And so you would want to, control for those things and see if you do still have that same impact. Does education still have that impact on income level? So here we have the example I've been talking about. Does it pay to go to college? So our operational definitions, we want to operationalize education. We want to operationalize earnings in the form of income. And so the researchers here would, review a state-by-state comparison of income and educational levels. The hypothesis is the higher one's educational degree, the more money they will earn. So the variables become, your level of education in terms of what highest degree obtained. Was it a high school degree? Was it a bachelor's degree, master's degree? Looking at all the associate's degree. And then the various levels of income. How much personal income did that person receive? And this information was collected by the Census Bureau. And Census Bureau, they're actually conducting a decennial census this year. So they're collecting that data. That data was through the census, secondary data analysis, and the conclusion was that people with more schooling do earn more money than others. Even though there were some exceptions, the more, higher your level of education indicated higher income levels. Some exceptions could be that you may, maybe the person has a trade. Maybe they're electricians or plumbers that, the prestige of that occupation may not be very high, but their income might be high. So you'd want to consider other things that might account for that. And here's how, you kind of look at the different, they map this out state by state, looking at educational levels and household income levels. And it almost is a mirror image. So states with higher income levels also have states with higher, median incomes, household incomes. I think they measured household income levels. So it was really interesting to see how they almost look identical. I mean, there's some exceptions there, but you can tell that something's going on, and it's worthy of the research. And this is another way they illustrate, and which is another thing to consider when you're doing research. It's really hard to look at a table full of numbers. So illustrating it in the form of a graph or a depiction on a map can help the reader visually see. And right away, what jumps out as, people with associate's degree, 54%, are making over $60,000 a year. So you've got more people with a higher college degree are making those higher income levels, when only 20%, 19%, close to 20% with a high school diploma. So it's a smaller percentage of those without a college degree that would be making that high income. And the more people are making with a high school degree are only making 25 to almost 40,000 a year. So again, in summary, the steps we would look at in the process, the 5 steps in the scientific method. In case there's a question about this on the test, you know what the order is. Now, this isn't to say that, well, maybe we are doing literature first and then, defining our problems. Some of the steps kind of overlap. So don't get caught up in, strictly holding to the order, because sometimes they do overlap. But if we were to write up the ordering of the steps, you first want to define your problem, then you review the literature, then you formulate a testable hypothesis, then you go out and collect and analyze the data, and then you develop the conclusion. Now, in this module, we're going to focus on the major research designs that we would select in, and what a research design is, it's our plan, it's our method for obtaining the data in a scientific manner. And these are often based on theory and hypotheses that the researcher starts with. So it's typically a researcher will have a theory in mind when they approach their topic, and then come up with that formulated hypothesis. So, for example, when I was about to approach my interest in adolescent pregnancy, I had attended an all-girls high school, and that prompted me to want to study. There were a couple girls who, during the 4 years I was at this all-girls high school, who had gotten pregnant, and they actually dropped out of school to have their babies, and I was concerned about that interruption in their education, and so I had a theory that that maybe things didn't fare well for them, or it didn't fare well for their children, and so I was very concerned about that. And what my theory was is that maybe what was the driving force behind this happening? Why couldn't they continue on with their education? And so I was looking at it from both the feminist perspective and even the interactionist perspective. What was going on even within their families? Was there pressure from home and from others to kind of drop out of high school? And so in doing my research, I was approaching this not in terms of, I was looking at secondary data. And so that was a way for me to get easy access to data that was already collected, that then I can analyze in the way in which I wanted to really look at how are the mothers doing and how are their babies doing. And so it was sort of a two-pronged approach. So what I'm going to do now is really go over these different types of research design, because very well I could have chosen to survey people. I don't know how forthcoming I would have been able to find those kind of subjects to do my study, but ethnography would have been difficult. You can't really go into people's homes readily and observe them. That would be an ethnography. And experiments are usually the last. We don't really rely that heavily on experiments, and we'll talk about why that is in a moment. So the four major research designs that I just mentioned were surveys, observations or ethnographies, experiments, and existing data sources or secondary data. So the first one we're going to go over are surveys. Surveys provide researchers with information about how people think or how they act. You can straightforwardly ask questions. They're generally in the form of an interview or an actual prepared questionnaire. The interview is when the researcher conducts that, it could be either face-to-face, it could be on the phone, and now we have the ability to do online surveying to help gather that information. The questionnaire is when we use a printed or written form to obtain information from the respondent. Either way, you do need to have, a consistent form. So the questionnaire is then also used by the interviewer. They can be a little bit more flexible in, following up those questions, but you usually want to have a scripted, a tested version of your questions. So the survey is one example of what we call quantitative research, but we also have something that's known as qualitative research. Now, survey questions must be worded very carefully. So that's what I meant by when we talk about a questionnaire or even doing an interview, you need to be sure that the questions that you use, how are they worded? The changes, we can see an impact on the way questions are worded, and how we say things might change and vary over time. For example, here the Bureau of Labor had to change the responses to unemployment questions in 2010 because joblessness had become so chronic. We're even seeing, changes in wording today, and the way we talk about illness and viruses and words, COVID-19 and, these terms that hadn't been in our vocabulary before, now may need to be updated and addressed in some of our research that we do. So surveys are an example of what we call this quantitative research. We're able to collect data and quantify it and be able to make statistical comparisons in the data. So quantitative research is research that collects and reports data primarily in numerical form, and the survey is really lends its way to do that. Whereas qualitative research relies on what is seen in the field, naturalistic settings, often focuses on small groups and communities rather than on large groups. Also, qualitative can be in the form of, long, worded, open-ended questions where we let somebody kind of really describe a situation when we're talking to them. So examples of the qualitative research would be the participant observation, the ethnographies, those observations. The qualitative research can also lend itself to to really expand on. So if we have a question that someone answers yes or no to in our survey, but we want to follow up, well, why is that? And so it allows us to follow up by, probing the respondent to really explain more in an open-ended type question. So I usually pose this in our face-to-face class by doing a poll, but I'm going to actually talk through it here right now. But if I were to ask this question, are you a cell phone only user? And if you don't read any more than that, what would your response be to that question? Are you a cell phone only user? Now, if this was a question that was on a form, you wouldn't have somebody to say, well, what do you mean by that? And if I put don't know as an option, a lot of people would probably say don't know because you don't understand what that question really is. So there are some problems that can arise from that, asking a question in that way. You need to really be clear so that everybody understands what you mean. And the reason this question came about was because people were switching their landlines to only cell phones. But it can mean, do you use a laptop? Do you use other sorts of technology? And so that's really what, and when I pose the question to a class, that's usually what often happens. Now, if I ask an open-ended question, I want to know what you think problems could arise from doing a telephone survey. And I really don't know what, those options might be, so I'm going to pose it in an open-ended way and allow my respondents to give me any kind of option. Maybe, they live in a home that doesn't have, that doesn't have a landline, or maybe they live in a remote area that doesn't have good reception to their phones. Maybe people are calling at bad times. They're eating dinner and they don't want to, answer a telephone survey while they're in the middle of their dinner. So we want to think about those things, and if an open-ended question arises, you can actually, they're not limiting you to what options that they choose. But a closed-ended question can limit your options to what those forced choices might be. There's just different ways to ask questions. And so here is where I would pose the question in our class. Okay. Before I move on to ethnography, just one other point I wanted to make about survey questionnaires, some of the advantages of doing it. Compared to most of the other methods we're going to talk about, it is probably the least expensive to administer because you can, for example, when I worked at Cooper Hospital for a number of years in the planning and research department, and I was responsible for getting out the patient satisfaction surveys, which everyone loves to get after they've had a doctor's appointment or a hospitalization. But those surveys are very important to the administrators because they can really get to, what can they improve in the delivery of their services. So, but you can mail out a lot of questionnaires, and knowing that not everyone is going to send it back, but hopefully some people will feel the need to send those things back. Another advantage is you can have a list of uniform questions, and answers allow the researchers to make comparisons to really compare across the sample. And samples for this type of survey research can be quite large. We can reach a lot of people. Now, with ethnography, this type of research relies on collecting information through either direct participation or by closely watching a group or community. So through observation, you are able to just observe the people that you're looking at. So ethnography is the study of an entire social setting through extended systematic field work, where you actually immerse yourself in that particular environment. Observation is basically that technique of ethnography where you can be watching the group not unobtrusively and just watch the group or organization. And so it often relies on pretty small sample size. And I'll give you an example, a couple of examples. The first is my own example in doing this type of research. As I mentioned, I worked at Cooper Hospital for a number of years, and I was, doing a research project in the, I was under a trauma injury research grant. And I had permission to observe the trauma intensive care unit. And I wanted to see the interactions between the attending physicians and the nurses and how they incorporated, family members of, traumatically injured or ill patients. And, I stood in the background, but I wore scrubs. I stood back. I observed the interactions. How did the doctors talk to the nurses? How did they talk to the family members? And I got to even interview the one attending physician that really explained, the critical time that they're trying to save a person's life, and that's such a traumatic time where they're not worried about, bedside manner. They're barking orders. They're getting to save this person's life. And so I learned that through observation and then also following it up with a survey, an interview actually. That's one example. And another example is the classic study of William White out of the University of Chicago. He, in the 1930s, studied, he moved into a low-income Italian neighborhood in Boston, and he lived there. He lived with a family for a number of years. He gained the trust of somebody, they used to hang out on the street corners in Boston. And so the title of his work was called Street Corner Society, in case anybody is interested in reading it. It was published in 1943. He spent 4 years living there, totally kind of like a reporter without revealing his sources. He gained their trust, he hung out, and he basically reported on his results. Barbara Ehrenreich is a more current sociologist who wrote Nickel and Dimed on not getting by in America. And what she attempted to do was, again, an ethnography, participant observation, where she moved to 3 different states in the course of her work and tried to live on minimum wage. And it's a very interesting study of she's had articles that are broken out from this book, but it's a very good study. She was disguising herself as a divorced middle-aged housewife without a college degree and set out to find out if she could make it on minimum wage, which at the time was only about $7 an hour. It's still only about $7.25 nationally, and it's varying by state. We'll talk more about that in future chapters. Yeah, she worked as a waitress in Key West, Florida, and she needed to find a second job to pay her rent. She also needed to get roommates because she couldn't pay the rent on minimum wage. She went to Maine. She worked as a residential aide, and she also went to Minnesota, where she worked at a Walmart. And each place it was very challenging to survive on minimum wage. So ethnographic research includes the collection of historical information, conducting in-person interviews. A participant observation, similar to what Barbara Ehrenreich did, is a method where a sociologist joins the group. And so for a period of time, what I did was more of just an observation, not a participant. I didn't participate. I wasn't a nurse. I wasn't a doctor. I couldn't get involved. I stayed in the background. So we really try to get a good understanding of of what's going on from the perspective of those in that environment. So we try to stay detached. We don't want to interfere or interrupt anything. We just want to let things happen naturally. So this is not, we study the entire social setting through extended systematic observation. We might code things if we see, you know, some sort of repetitive types of things happen. The emphasis is in an ethnography is usually on how the subjects themselves view their social life in their setting. So again, and I've given you those examples. Oh, here's a new area of ethnography, visual sociology. It's the use of photographs and film and videos to study society, and this is becoming really a hot topic because of everyone's use of, you know, phones and being able to capture things through their cell phones and the ability to be right there in the moment. So these photographs and other visual images help to improve our understanding of events, especially, you know, now what's going on with the different social movements, the Black Lives Matter movement, anything that really affects social behavior. We can really capture that and study it through still pictures and videography. So it includes that conscious creation of that visual record through documentary and photography, and you're capturing moments in time, in real time. Very interesting field. Experiments. Now, experiments are an artificially created situation that allows a researcher to manipulate the variables. Pure experiments require the use of an experimental group that is exposed to the independent variable, and a control group that's not exposed to that independent variable. Now, sociologists, this is more scientific research, pure, the natural sciences. We tend not to use this as frequently as those in the natural sciences, relying on experimental control groups due to, the fact that we study humans. We would not want to bring danger or inflict any sort of danger or withhold anything that could benefit someone, that might cause harm to humans. That's why we have a code of ethics. And we do have in our history research that the Stanford prison experiment, for example, social psychological study. We also have Milgram's experiment, which we're going to talk about as well. So that's this experiment where they gave the electric shocks if someone got a question wrong. If you're not familiar with it, I'm going to go over it. But these types of experiments is what led to our code of ethics, especially since we're studying humans. And so we have to be careful when it comes to experimental research. There also is the risk of this Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect refers to the tendency for test subjects to change their typical behavior because they know that they're under investigation. It gets the name from the Hawthorne electrical plant in the 1920s and 30s, where they made changes to working conditions, and they all had a positive effect because the workers knew they were being observed, so they thought, oh, they must want to see something, and so they changed their behavior. And that's not what we want to see happen. We want things to occur naturally. Then we have the use of existing data sources, and we also call it secondary data analysis, and that refers to making use of previously collected or publicly accessible information. A lot of data these days are easily accessible through the internet, through .orgs, like a government site, or even an association like the American Sociological Association or American Psychological Association. You can find a lot of data in their sites that you can access. Whereas when I was in graduate school, your department had to pay a lot of money for a data set to be brought into the department, and hopefully more than one graduate student was using that data set. So it could have been very costly, but now we're seeing a lot of the data easily accessible, especially census data, Census Bureau data. vital statistics, as I have listed here, health data. A lot of the health data that's published is either you're given permission by the person to access it, or more than likely it's through HIPAA. There's a lot of privacy concerns, so you've got to either gain permission from somebody, or they strip a lot of personalized, anything personal. Sociologists and researchers don't want personal information necessarily. We want generalization. We want to be able to generalize. So we're not that interested in it, oh, Jane Doe said X, Y, or Z. No, we want to know in general, what do women say about a particular topic? What do men say about it? That sort of thing. Longitudinal surveys are very useful to us because they track a particular person over a length of time, and you can get a lot of data that way. Governmental sources like the Census Bureau, but also crime statistics. Now, there'll be issues we'll talk about when we get to our chapter on deviance. Not everything gets reported in crime data, but there is some valuable information that can be gleaned from that. Vital statistics, birth records, death records, marriage records, any sort of housing records, things that are public, out there for the public, researchers can use and analyze. Now here's, before we get to the content analysis, so again, the secondary data sources are generally inexpensive for researchers to use, as I mentioned, and the data is used often in ways that were not intended by the original data collectors. So that's another issue. There are pros and cons. You can find a wealth of information, but it could be very limited because the data was collected for a specific purpose. The census data is collected to count the population. They collect a lot of interesting information, but it is intended to count the population. So the question may not be worded in a way we would maybe like, or there may be information that's not there that we would like to see. So there are a lot of useful data sources, but there are definitely limitations. Researchers may not find the information that they're looking for, and they are limited to what was collected. And not all cases may be reported. So especially in the case of the crime data. So we need to be careful when we do use this sort of information. Now, content analysis is another form of secondary data. It refers to the systematic coding and objective recording of data guided by some rationale. Now, I do an activity which I'm going to try to do on Monday morning with you. It's a activity where we do a content analysis of preschool children's books. So when we look at these children's books, we take something very qualitative. We take something that's been written for the pleasure of young children, and we're going to code it, seeing, how many times do we see boys? How many times do we see girls? We're going to try to see if there's some gender component, like gender stereotypes that might be present in these books. As a socialization tool. So we're going to take something that was written for a different purpose, but use it to kind of code and do an analysis. So we're guided by a rationale. Like, what do we want to find out? We want to find out if there's some gender component to what's in these children's books. And we're going to compare books that were written in the 1940s and 50s to books that were written in more current times. So we're going to record those instances of gender roles and quantify them. So what a researcher can do is study these various documents. We can look at children's books. We can look at college textbooks. We can look at newspapers, periodicals, watch, radio, listen to radio, watch TV programs, movies, and the internet is now giving us a wealth of knowledge, but different scripts, diaries, songs, music, poetry, journals, people who write in journals, folklore, and legal papers. So there's a wealth of content analysis that we can do. And here, frequently, commonly used the most frequently used sources, and some other sources. The census data, crime statistics, vital statistics are probably the most frequently used. And then you can see speeches, public figures, attendance records for different venues, who goes to what types of concerts, web pages, blogs, all sorts of things now that with the technology that we have. I worked with a professor at Temple when I was a student there. She was studying actually adolescent pregnancy, and that's how we got connected, because I was interested in that as well. And one of the tasks that I did for her was to do a content analysis of magazines that young girls were interested in reading. And so was there anything in these magazines that kind of influenced young women to want to become mothers? So you look for things, you have something in mind, and you're looking for any kind of information that might back that up. So here's a summary of the major research designs. Remember, I mentioned that you're going to see these tables in mostly every chapter, where you can, write 3x5 cards if that's a way you like to study. Okay, probably one of the last modules we're going to cover in this chapter are the ethics, code of ethics in research. The American Sociological Association has developed this code of ethics. It was first published in 1971, and this is the revision that was done in 1997. But they continue to revise it. As you can see, the item 9 was revised in 1999. So because most of our research is conducted on humans, we need rules to be able to protect them. And so this is, there's quite a few items, I think over 30. We're just going to cover these 7 to really get an idea of the main code of ethics that we follow as researchers. And the first is that we want to maintain objectivity and integrity in the research. So we need to be objective. We need to kind of distance ourselves, not be so personal to the research. So, for example, in the intensive care unit that I was studying, as much as I felt for the patient lying in that hospital bed, I had to be objective. I had to be, concentrating on what I was focusing on studying. And not get personal. Just like the physician said that they try not to get personal initially. It's until after they've had that patient sort of recover that they can then improve on their bedside manner. So we need to respect that person's dignity, their privacy. They're in a very compromising position, and many of the topics we study in sociology are very personal and sensitive, and so we want to make sure that the person knows we're going to protect their privacy and be, and the integrity of the information that they provide to us. We want to protect them from any kind of personal harm. We won't put them in any danger. We preserve their confidentiality. I don't want to know that Jane Doe said something. I'll cross her name off immediately and add a number to her survey, so that it really just gives me the information and not connects it to a particular person. So we really do our best to maintain that confidentiality, ensure that person that we're going to maintain and preserve their confidentiality. We do seek informed consent. There are forms to be filled out that that the subject is knowledgeable that they are giving their consent, especially when the behavior occurs in a private context. Public environments are, especially if they're unobtrusive, it's public, but anything in a private setting needs to be, we need to get consent. We also need to acknowledge research collaboration and assistance. You definitely want to make sure that if you're working with someone, everyone gets credit for what their task was, what they did, how they contributed. And the last thing is to disclose all sources of financial support. You need to be able to, if someone's giving you a grant, you need to acknowledge, who that funding was from. So if you're studying, here's a good example of why you would want to be able to disclose that. If you're studying, tobacco use among young people, how they're using. Oh, and the new thing is vaping. If you're studying that and you're getting money from, the people who make the device, or you're getting, money from, Marlboro, a company that, produces cigarettes or makes cigarettes, there's going to be questionable, where that funding is coming from, and any bias. You want to, eliminate any sort of bias in your study. Here's examples of this. Confidentiality is so important in the studies that we do. It involves, we don't, we want to keep the information, who we got it from, secret. Rick Scarce was a graduate student who was conducting research on environmental protesters. They were protesting laboratory research, and he literally went to jail for 159 days. He spent 159 days in jail, refusing to reveal a subject of break-in at a research lab. So he didn't, he maintained that confidentiality to the point where he spent time in jail. And here's we have an example of the conflict of interest that can occur when researchers accept funding for their research. Sort of what I just explained to an example of the tobacco industry. So you must be careful it doesn't influence a lot of pharmaceutical companies, the tobacco industry, and in this example, the Exxon Valdez. What happened when the oil spilled? The federal jury had ordered Exxon to pay $5.3 billion in damages. The company approached legal scholars, including sociologists and psychologists, to study jury deliberations to develop evidence for an appeal. They were trying to appeal to pay less. So the scholars who accepted that funding were questioned about their conflict of interest. So it's very important to kind of be able to be as neutral as possible. And here we have the value neutrality that Max Weber stresses in terms of the objectivity a sociologist must have in interpreting their data. It's important because, we all have personal views, and when we approach a topic, we may be, personally involved in it, have personal opinions about it, but we have to, we have this obligation to accept the findings, even when they go against our personal views, or if they go against our theoretical views or explanations, or if they're not widely accepted beliefs, if they're not the popular beliefs, we still need to report what those findings are. So I mentioned here we might briefly go over the new developments, and it has to do really with feminist methodology. Even in data-rich future, how we have more access to data. So feminist methodology has had a great impact on the development of methodology, and we see work and family being closely integrated. Even victimization, self-injury studies, feminists have shown an interest in that. Its impact on because 85% of self-injurers were in fact females. The impact on global resources, research, what is going on globally in terms of women. So they want to include more women into these studies, more oriented towards social change, public consciousness, and really involving, feminists tend to involve a more multidisciplinary approach. So they tend to involve and consult with subjects more frequently than other researchers, again, raising public awareness and so forth. So that has had a really big impact on methodology. Queer theory, again, has even further addressed issues in research studies challenging sexual orientation and generalizations that have been inherent in much research. Proponents have asked whether researchers consider gay and lesbians in their studies or assume any generalizations they make to apply to all people. So again, also this veiled reporting technique where respondents are asked whether they consider themselves to be heterosexual in the context of much less sensitive questions. Because if you go right to the heart of a question, it might put that respondent on guard. and not be willing to answer further questions in your study. So again, having the new theory, queer theory and methodology, has helped improve our data methods. And again, the data-rich future is where we're seeing, this accessibility to data through the advances in our technology. We're able to capture a lot of the data. Big Brothers Big Sisters mentoring program. We've gotten a survey to kind of capture that information, being able to hold it in large data sets. Research found kids in the mentoring program had more problems than those not in the program, so they're able to track sort of these different issues in different programs and being able to compare those programs. Also, again, the spread of influenza and other contagious diseases here was in reference to previous viruses. And now, as you could see, the urgency to find and get to the bottom of COVID-19 has really stepped up, and even large corporations were able to produce masks and provider protective equipment, PPEs that they talk about. So we're able to see where those hot spots are in the country and address them immediately and provide that those PPEs and ventilators and all that sort of thing to where it's needed the most. So data helps, this data-rich environment we live in has helped supporting other areas. Crime patterns as well, where are we seeing an uptick in crime and housing issues. And I think you'll see that example in your textbook where you can track different areas where housing is an issue in Boston. So increasing the data, it could arise concerns where there may not have been before, but it also provides information that can be very helpful. Here, again, you can see how the data is then put out visually in terms of a map. Housing issues where it's highest is the dark green, and you can see where it's concentrated. So it helps researchers be able to pinpoint where they need to provide assistance. In Appendix 1 and Appendix 2, and I'm not going to go over it specifically here. I don't usually do this in my face-to-face class either, but these are descriptive statistics that a lot of researchers will use and report in their data. And then they might use even more higher level, more sophisticated statistical analysis like regression and that sort of thing. But we usually try to, look at things in terms of percentages, averages, where is the, measures of central tendency, what rates can we look at, and data like that. So Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 will give you a sense of the type of statistics, the type of graphs and visualizations and data presentations that we do. And also in Appendix 2 is about how the research, writing a report. Reading those graphs, what a cross tabulation is. That cross tabulation is where you cross, two variables together and you can present it in a table. This is an example of a line graph. Changes in the attitude toward the legalization of marijuana. How we can see attitudes are changing. People are becoming. The question is, do you think the use of marijuana should be made legal or not? So many people are starting to increase. The percentage of people who think it should be legal has been increasing over time. And then we want to take that same statistic and cross-tabulate it with, your political party. If you're Democratic, you might be more likely to think it should be legal. If you're a younger person, you might be more inclined to think it should be legal versus an older person who might be a little bit more set in their ways. And Appendix 2 is again about how to write a research report, where you find the information, all of these different ways to kind of explore a topic, learn something about it more, going to the library, asking, going into newspapers, asking your professors, that sort of thing. And then, how to write up that report, writing a draft, getting the information down, reading it out loud and citing your sources.